All right. Well, I'm thrilled to introduce Rob Dunn, who I've known for many years. He was my PhD co-advisor, and I'm fortunate to continue working with him as he's a member of TRISOM's advisory board. Rob is a William Neal Reynolds Distinguished Professor in the Department of Applied Ecology at North Carolina State University. He holds a PhD in Ecology and Evolution from the University of Connecticut and spent his early research career studying biodiversity of tropical forests and seed dispersal. He's now a scientist with diverse interests, ranging from the ecology and evolution of urban arthropods to the microbes living in human belly buttons, with lots of fascinating projects in between. His research efforts center public engagement, whether through science, citizen science for data collection, or through innovative outreach partnerships with museums or K-12 schools. He's a broad thinker about the world around us and is the person who initially got me thinking about the implications of evolution for our everyday lives. He's the author of 7 books, including his newest, A Natural History of the Future, which he'll be talking about today. Rob, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Meredith. I'm going to take 1 second here to get my slides going. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Sorry, I started on the end. You can see the whole talk backwards for a second if you're a quick reader. So I'm going to talk today about the natural history of the future. And I'm going to focus on the natural history of cities. And a lot of the content from today's talk will be drawn from my new book, Natural History of the Future. And the focus on cities for today is partially because the natural history of the entire world doesn't fit into a short talk, but also because, I'm sorry, the admittance is still pinging me. Also because if we look globally at what's happening around us, cities are an ever more important part of the global ecosystem. And so more and more people live in cities. The rate at which people are moving to cities is accelerating. And also because cities are a place where we have a really dominant effect on how ecological systems work. And so what I'm going to do to start off today is to go back and think a little bit about how we've imagined settlements in cities through time and what that says about how we're thinking about the living world. And so if we go far enough back in time, all of our settlements were built using vernacular architecture that had no written plan that reflected traditional architectural types that were very often matched to the place in which they were built. And so if you look at flooded places around the world, very often you see houses with stilts. This is convergent cultural evolution of a kind of architecture that makes sense given the environment. But there comes a time in the history of cities in particular in which the way in which people thought about building and the way in which they thought about living together also began to have this strong written and artistically depicted ideological component. And so we start to see the settlements and eventually cities, not just as places where things are built that reflect the environment, but where things are built in ways that reflect ideas. And so, for example, you see the ideal city that celebrates the values in a well-ordered society with architecture standing as a metaphor for good government. Or much later, you see an anti-gravity city. As we start to build skyscrapers, the city becomes a place in which images of the city and then eventually the city itself reflect the extent to which humanity can tangle with gravity, can relate the city to this fundamental force. And what you know in both of these examples is that the city becomes defined relative to some kind of idea or force. First, what the ideal city should look like, in this case, what gravity does. And this goes on through time. And so you begin to get these other kinds of idealized cities where also gravity continues to feature. You get cities where we get different levels of movement. And so people move among buildings high above the ground. And some of these kinds of cities are realized, some are not realized. This is a particular version that was very popular in art and never became quite as popular in reality. And in this case, they're kind of scooting along on a series of chairs that push them from one building to another. Another moment in the history of thinking about the future of cities is a moment in which cities begin to be thought about in the context of a new force, not gravity, but in this case, cars. And so here you have the moto city. And so the city is reimagined so as to reflect this gravity-like force that cars have. And this has many versions. This is a famous Frank Lloyd Wright version for Los Angeles. But you see these again and again around the world. We build cities, or we imagine cities first, and then we would later build cities to reflect cars. And now if we think about the future of cities, one of the most common depictions of future cities is one in which those cities relate to a new kind of force, which is relative to the internet and algorithms. And so the smart city celebrates and responds to the nature-like power of the internet. One of the things to notice in all of these visions of current and future cities is that the adaptation of these cities no longer occurs in relation to local climate or local biological realities. The cities become abstracted and exist in reference to physical universals like gravity, particular innovations like cars or space travel, or to a lesser extent, local culture. Life and climate are excluded through control. And this reaches an extreme in the context of Buckminster Fuller's bubbled city concept, where the rest of the world is actually pushed out. And so the city exists in its own confined space, much as if it were on another planet. And in fact, you see very similar images of cities on other planets that are essentially that same kind of model, in which the city is an enclosed world unto itself. But one of the things you'll start to notice in these cities is that the rest of life retreats. And so here's the famous Jetsons future. And I forget the dog's name. Somebody will put it in the chat, I'm sure. I almost remember it. But the only non-human species in this scene, and in fact, in the entire Jetsons show, is for the most part the dog. It's the domesticate. And the rest of life is somewhere else. And in recent visions of the future of cities, we start to see life creep back in, but very often it's in the form of green space that's also a kind of domesticate. It's green space that's a kind of pet almost. And so this is Dixon de Pommiers' famous vision for the future of cities with vertical gardens, but these gardens are indoors. They're controlled, they're under that bubble. And so my argument with this talk is that there's a problem with this vision for the future of life. And the problem is a misconception about our relationship to the rest of life. Oops. And the problem is that implicit in these views of the city is a set of false assumptions. There's the false assumption of knowingness, that we understand the world, of lifelessness, that the places we clean are free of life, control, independence, and a living world without agency. And what I want to do now is sort of walk through the problems created by these assumptions and a set of rules associated with the realities that are more true than these assumptions, and then how we might go about incorporating those into the ways we think about the future world. And I'll just say, if you want to zone out, the talk and book take home from here on forward is that life is a force more powerful than gravity or engineers, cars, or the internet, and that we'll only be able to make sensible choices about the future if we understand our assumptions and life's rules. And one might even call them laws. We can debate laws versus rules versus regularities, but the point there is there are these regular features of how life works, and we'll be better off if we pay attention to them. The first assumption that's baked into many of our views of the future of cities, the future of life on other planets, is the assumption of knowingness. And for me, there's an associated rule that violates this assumption. And the rule is, in fact, that every time we check in about how much we know about the living world, we in fact know very little, and we almost invariably know less than we think we do. And for me, the classic story of this is the story of Terry Irwin, who working in a tropical forest in Panama was asked by another biologist if he could estimate the number of insect species that might be found in that tropical forest. At first he said no, but Terry at this point had been fogging trees. He'd been collecting ground beetles, which because of a quirk of nomenclature live primarily in the tops of trees. And he went about trying to estimate, based on the collections he was making from these trees, how many arthropod species, how many tropical arthropod species there might be on Earth. And he came up with a number that was vastly greater than the number that was currently known. And that number has continued to be debated, but the consensus remains that most tropical the vast majority of tropical arthropods are still not named, which is to say the average tropical arthropod you pick up in a forest is likely not to be named. And in fact, in most regions on Earth, this remains true. And so the animals flying around us are not yet named, much less studied, much less understood. But the bigger window into our ignorance came not from arthropods, but from more recent work on microbes. And it's a scaling study by Ken Losey and Jay Lennon. And in this study, Losey and Lennon used sort of basic scaling rules to predict how many species of bacteria there might be on Earth. And what they predicted is that there might be 1 trillion species of bacteria on Earth. And this has received some skepticism, but even what skeptics agree to is that we're so ignorant about the bacteria species around us that a good estimate is still a long way off. And even if Losey and Lennon are off by 3 zeros, it's still 1 billion species of bacteria and just 30,000 are so far named. And so by any real measure, the living world around us is still mostly unknown. And so as we manage our cities, we think about our future cities, we need to be thinking not about things that we control and know, but instead things that are likely to surprise us. The second assumption implicit in most of these views is that life is fragile and that the end of nature is near and that we're preserving all of life. And often in these bubble-like realities. And the second rule I think here is that what we know about life is that life itself as a whole is typically far more tolerant of extremes than is humanity. And so when we think about what's threatened, it's far more likely to be humanity in almost any circumstance than it is life itself. The most extreme conditions we find on Earth are inhabited by a wonderful diversity of small and often stinky microbes. This includes the Danakil Depression in Ethiopia, which is toxic to humans by any measure. It includes the deepest mines yet dug on Earth, but it also includes those habitats in our daily lives that we think of as devoid of life. And so, for example, in my lab, we've studied a lot places like Manhattan and New York City. And when people typically focus on Manhattan, what they study are these green places, like you see Central Park, you see Inwood Park green here. But what we decided about 10 years ago was to start to try to study these gray places. What's the life that's inhabiting the places that are not full of photosynthesis in the green living world? What's inhabiting a block like this block on Broadway? And so what we did is embark on a whole series of projects in which we engaged the public to send us samples. We went into people's houses. We studied these gray spaces of the world to figure out what was living there. Were these lifeless places? Were our houses really part of the end of nature? What did we find when we started this? There was really no good sense of how much one would find in a house. A quick take home is that we found thousands of plant species floating through houses, whether in the form of pollen or actually little bits of plants, 40,000 fungal species, 2,000 arthropod species and growing, 80,000 bacteria species. And so the houses that we studied were actually quite full of life. And this included not just the places we would think are habitable in houses, but actually we are most likely to find unusual and interesting species in the places we would think are totally uninhabitable. And so hot water heaters were full of interesting species typically found in hot springs. Freezers and fridges were full of really interesting cold adapted species. Fermented foods are full of species that have really unique environments. Dishwasher soap dishes are full of extremophiles. Salt grains in salt shakers have interesting halophilic bacteria inside, and archaeans inside the actual salt grains. And so here's this whole world in what's supposed to be lifeless, supposed to be under control, that's diverse. And going back to that first rule, mostly not named, mostly not studied. And in fact, never have we found lifelessness in all the houses we've studied, despite our actions. In fact, there's no sign of the end of living nature in our homes, in our cities. We do not control whether there's life there, but instead which life there is, which relates to the third assumption. The third assumption is that we are in control. And the rule here is that our control is in fact modest, with one exception. And we see this in many ways, but we see it especially in houses. And so this is a plot where 2 points, each point is a sample of a house, and 2 points are closer together if they're more similar in terms of which bacteria species they have. And so you can see there's a bunch of green species in this lower corner, and those are species associated with food associated things: refrigerators, kitchen counters, cutting boards. There's one TV screen that looks as though it's got food microbes on it. I don't know, maybe a hot dog thrown in the TV, some things you don't want to know. And then we see outdoor associated species clumping together. And we see species associated with pillowcases and toilet seats, which are not terribly different. But it's this really kind of modest effect we're having on what's in our houses as a function of where we're looking in our houses. It's a modest ecological filtering. It's not great control. And in fact, we've seen this as we've looked at many more houses, thousands of houses at this point. One of the things with the biggest impact on which microbes are in the house is the number of occupants in the house, and whether they're male or female. And so the more humans there are in a house, the more human associated microbes we find. Typically, it's a function of density. More women in the house, we see more vaginal associated microbes all over the house. More men in the house, we see more armpit microbes. And so this is a kind of control of this environment, but it's really weak kind of control. The other thing that has a really big effect, and it's the biggest effect we've ever seen, is whether or not you have a dog in a house. If you have a dog, there are a whole suite of bacteria species, and actually fungal species too, that are much more common, not just where the dog sleeps, but also on the pillowcases of the people and even on the TV screen. And so this dog effect is big, and you could call that control, but there's not so much intentionality to it. The other thing we've seen is whether or not you're fermenting foods, which fermented foods you're making, and how you're making them affects what's in the house. And this can be a bigger effect. And this is interesting because it's actually kind of a reciprocal effect. The fermented food affects the microbes in the house. The microbes in the house affect the fermented food. And the fermented food actually also affects the body microbes of the people. And so here's some control, but again, pretty modest. How you heat and cool your house, whether or not you open your windows has some effect. But the truth is, if we look at human houses today as sort of overall, and we compare them to chimp nests, what we overall see is that we actually see microbes that we would tend to characterize as more healthful in a chimp nest than we do in the average human house. And so to the extent that we're controlling things, we're not necessarily creating environments that are more healthful for ourselves, apart from very basic public health interventions like clean drinking water and hand washing and things of that like. Often at this point in the talk, people think that although in general we found houses to be full of life, and in general we see very little evidence of control, that there's this sense that I can seal my building, I can filter my air, I can scrub and isolate. And in fact, at one point when I mentioned this part of our work, a guy stood up in the audience and he said, I worked for NASA on the International Space Station, and I actually put the filters in the space station to control life there, and we did a good job. Well, I think this is a good context in which to look to the International Space Station and the Mir, the former Russian space station, to figure out when you do that, when you use the best filters, when you treat everything that goes up there, when the windows open to a lifeless world outside, how much control can you have and what lives there, if anything? And what we can say is that a whole lot lives there. On the Russian space station, there were all kinds of fungi. There were dust mites, there were tapeworms. Most of the fungi were plastic eaters or even metal eaters, species tolerant of extremes. This included fungi that grew over the window of the mirror to the point of making it impossible to see outside. And so the grandeur of space was obscured by the power of life, which I find fascinating. And the bacteria, all kinds of bacteria. And we can actually plot these bacteria on that same kind of figure I showed you earlier, where closer together things are more similar, and show that the space station, the International Space Station, has microbes that are very closely associated with toilet seats and pillowcases. And so Even on the space station, life perseveres, and even on the space station, our control is modest. The one exception with regard to our control is an ephemeral one, is that in our cities, in our homes, we are producing and using extraordinary quantities of antimicrobials and other biocides. And by most measures, this is going up around the world. Where it's not going up, it's because we're creating crops that actually produce their own biocides. And so, but the collective numbers are going up. And so this does exert a kind of control in that it's a strong selective pressure on the species in homes, and is favoring resistant pests, resistant weeds, resistant bacteria, and so on. And so this too, a kind of control, but not the kind we typically want. The control that leads us to be surrounded by resistant things. Assumption 4 in all of this is that we have full agency, that we can go about our world ignoring our past. And the rule here is the opposite, is that we remain, and it's no news to this audience, we remain dependent on our evolutionary history in almost every aspect of our daily lives. One that I find intriguing is from work we did a number of years ago, in which Michael Just was able to show that the preferred temperatures and humidity in human houses very much match the ancestral preferred temperatures and humidities of primates, which very much match our ancestral climates. And so buried in our everyday choices about what temperature to keep our buildings at is the residual impact of millions of years of evolution. And this is in some ways trivial and intriguing, but not too much more. But it has an enormous impact when we think about future climates and the temperatures that humans can bear that remain constrained by this evolutionary past. Assumption 5 here is that we're independent, that we can seal off our living worlds and seal life outside of those. We can seal off our daily lives and seal life outside of those daily lives, and just bring in those things that we need, and we don't need much. And so our perceived relation to the rest of life is something like this Calder mobile, where we would be at the top here, and other things depend on us, but we just depend on our own willpower and control. And certainly this is the model of Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos as they look to space, as they look to colonies on other planets, as they look to recreating the human story elsewhere. But in fact, everything we've learned about humans in the last decades suggests that our actual relationship to the rest of life is something more like this piece of the mobile at the bottom, where we depend on many species. And to me, I started my career working on termites, and termites are always emblematic of the kinds of dependencies one sees in nature. This is a physogastric queen full of eggs, and termites depend on all kinds of microbes to digest their food. Depending on which species of termite, there are different microbes, but very often the termites and the microbes are mutually unculturable. You can't grow the termites without the microbes, and you can't grow some of the microbes without the termites. And the termite deals with this by carrying the microbes that it needs to the next generation, and by exchanging microbes with each molt in the nest. Humans, we've come to understand, are in fact, in many ways, no different than this. When we have the wrong microbes, we see negative consequences for our skin, for ear infections, for cavities, for all sorts of gut problems, for all sorts of general inflammatory conditions. And we're coming to understand that if we want to deal with those problems, that we need a good way to acquire the microbes that we need to be healthy. And that in fact, our healthy lives are just as dependent on our good microbes as are those of termites. But the trick is, because humans never really had a problem acquiring microbes for most of our evolutionary past, we don't yet know how best to convey these microbes to the next generation. And so for the most part, we still acquire them through birth, through contact with other humans, from the soil, from leaves. And so we're dependent not only on these microbes, but on ways of passing them on. We also depend on all of the species we consume. Globally on Earth, it's tens of thousands of species, each of which is dependent on tens or more of other species. And so if we think about space life, if we think about sealed in life on Earth, the truth is, if we really want to live in perpetuity somewhere else, or if we really want to live sealed off from the rest of life, we need to bring a great deal of life with us. And that's going to include not just the connections to the rest of life. We need to acquire our microbes, the soil, our mothers, the trees, the plants we eat, but it even requires species like these dung beetles that process feces. And the rude truth about life on the International Space Station, for example, today, is that most of these processes are farmed out. The food from the space station comes from Earth. The microbes on the astronauts come from Earth, and the feces from the astronauts comes back to Earth to be processed by Earth species. And so we're still a long way from independence. And I think this reality is reflected in recent problems in the International Space Station, where astronauts have been trying to grow teeny tiny plants en route to imagining a future of growing plants in another colony somewhere. But what's become clear is that those plants already have plant pathogens. Recent studies showed that there are at least 2 different plant pathogens on the International Space Station. And so now there are attempts to bring probiotics up for the plants to save them from the plant pathogens. And so you can see that this dependence and the complexity of the living world already affects our attempts to live elsewhere. And so to summarize, a termite queen, when she flies, needs to carry only her microbes, and we must carry everything. And also, we need to carry the species in which we might someday depend, but don't yet depend. The 5th assumption here, and then I'm rounding toward the end of this talk, is that non-human life has no agency. And this is an idea that's actually gained more of a foothold recently in the context of the Anthropocene. And so the idea of the Anthropocene is that this is the human era. It's an era when our actions control life on Earth. But the suggestion implicit in the idea of the Anthropocene is that the other species on Earth don't have any control over the future. And I think this is a dangerous idea. And I think it's a dangerous idea that we're already seeing the problems with, because life, like a river, has a lot of agency. And we see this in COVID-19. COVID-19 certainly is exerting an effect on humanity outside of our direct impacts on the living world. Now, of course, it emerges only in the context of human actions, but then its story unfolds on top of our story. And the same is true of plant pathogens. If we think back through time to the potato famine, of course, the severity of the potato famine was contextualized in light of socio-political realities, and yet the blight itself was exercising impacts on the living world. And so I think this idea that we're the only ones with a contributing piece to the future of what the Earth will look like is a problematic one. And so I could talk more and more about these ideas, but the big picture for me is that as we look to the future of life, that we really need to be thinking about how do we imagine cities, how do we imagine societies that respond not to gravity, or not just to gravity, not just to cars, not just to the internet, but instead to the rest of life. What is this going to look like? How do we take as much time to really envision beautiful future cities with life in mind as we have with these other forces in mind? How do we make this a central project and not a marginal one? And to me, this is an important question, because to me, the details of the living world will have as much influence in the future as gravity's cars or the internet. And so how then do we imagine a future city, or indeed a future humanity, that plans as much for our relationship with the rest of life as we plan for gravity, cars, or the internet? And to me, this is 2 components, one ecological, one evolutionary. I talk a lot in the book about the ecological. How do we use what we already know about ecological rules to anticipate the ways in which a particular type of city, a particular type of society is going to interact with the living world? And so I won't talk about that more today, but it's something I'm very interested in. And I think it's something we partially overlooked, because I think ecologists are very interested in the past, very interested in the present, but in many ways, less likely to talk about the farther future, more than 50 years from today. The other piece of this is the rules of evolution. And here I think this is precisely what TRISEM, the Center for Evolutionary Medicine, and 5 other evolutionary medicine centers that are represented here today are doing. They're thinking about how do we take the rules of evolution and make them more central to how we plan medicine, how we plan agriculture, how we plan our cities. But I think the truth is that relative to some of these other discussions, relative to the Elon Musk discussions of the future and the Jeff Bezos discussions of the future, the discussions about evolution in the future are still relatively quiet discussions. And so I'd really like to start a conversation with those of you here to think about how do we bring evolutionary thinking into the fore of how we design what we're building for next generations? How do we make it a foregone conclusion that when you're thinking about a new city, when you're thinking about a new farm, that evolution is part of that story? What more can we do? And so these are my 2 questions for you. Just to repeat, how do we more ambitiously make evolutionary biology part of our attempts to plan for the future, and how do we visualize what this would look like? I think art is a really important part of this. I saw Lynn was here, I'm glad. And then I'm just going to quickly say at the end here that my interest in this future is really the next 100 years, the next 500 years. And often there's a resistance to thinking about this future. And when I've talked to city planners and architects, they often talk about a resistance from ecologists and evolutionary biologists with regard to the willingness to think about the far future and their willingness to think about the consequences of different human scenarios for life. But they also note that they'll continue to build whether or not ecologists and evolutionary biologists are part of that conversation. And what's being built today will have a long legacy of consequences in the interactions between humans and the rest of the living world. Just a quick very end piece here. This is the Cloaca Maxima in ancient Rome, built around 600 BCE. And it was built initially as both a waste and a stormwater conduit. It became primarily a stormwater conduit. By 79, Common Era Pliny the Elder writes, in the streets above, massive blocks of stone are dragged along, and yet the tunnels do not cave. They're pounded by falling buildings. The ground is shaken by earth tremors. But in spite of all, for 700 years, the channels have remained well nigh impregnable. Here is a much later depiction of the exit from the Cloaca Maxima. In 1961, Lewis Mumford writes, with its record of continuous service for more than 2,500 years, that sewer structure proves that in the planning of cities, low first costs do not necessarily denote economy. On these terms, the Cloaca Maxima has turned out to be one of the cheapest pieces of engineering on record. And here's the Cloaca Maxima today still working. The point is, how is what we're building today, how is what we're thinking about today going to shape future societies 100, 300, 500, or even 2,000 years from now? And how do we build the infrastructure for making biology a much bigger part of that story? And so thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rob. That was wonderful. We do have time for discussion, and we'd love to hear from you. If you have questions or comments or perspectives you'd like to share, feel free to post in the chat or to use the virtual raise hand, which you can do by clicking reactions at the bottom of your screen and then raise hand. And I see we have our first raised hand. We'll go to Brandon Ogbunu. Brandon, unmute yourself and go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Thank you for that seminar, and good luck and congratulations on the book. I think there's an excerpt that's in Wired magazine that I read that I really enjoyed. So really thank you for joining us. I guess my question had to do when we talk about ideas that have crafted the birth of the city, thinking about the American context, right? And I think, right, so think about that, and then talking about your independence kind of example you use, this effort by people like Musk and Bezos to separate human beings from one another. So using this, the thing that I think of in America, however, is much different, and that is exclusion has been one of the major forces that have crafted the American city, right? The American city, of course, has been crafted by who can't live in certain places, right? The Housing Act of 1949, the worldly Supreme Court case, these kind of things like that. So I think what's interesting was when I was hearing your talk, I don't even need to live with Musk and Bezos. They are these contemporary and historical examples of how cities have been crafted around separating populations of people. And that's kind of arguably the driver. I mean, everything from the way highways are built to the way schools are built has been about exclusion. So I guess what I was curious about is, right, how do you, where does that fit into your framework? And when you're thinking about the ideas that you talk about that have crafted cities, where does that force fit into your framework? And how can we superimpose some of the ideas that you introduced with that really, with that really real and fact-based history of the United States city, at least the United States city and many other parts of the world?
Yeah, that's a great comment and question, Brandon. Well, I'll give my on-the-fly answer, and then I'll continue to think about it. But so for me, a big part of how we think about historic thinking about cities is framed by art. It's framed by what we depict of cities. And that has many manifestations. And so for me, thinking about future cities, I mean, I think one of the things I would love to see is these diverse contexts in which to bring communities together to think about how do we together design the city that we want. And where part of that design is how do we think about that being an inclusive city with the societal goals we want to see. And part of that, and where I'm coming from, is to also have part of that conversation be about how does that city also relate to the rest of life. And so what I would hope for here is that as we imagine these next cities, and I mean, I think some of the most exciting things in this context is in speculative fiction, is that we're imagining these from many perspectives in ways that we didn't do in the past. And so I think that imagining step is incredibly important. And there are pieces of it there, but they're really atomized. And so how do we bring them together and then bring it together with the biology? Yeah, but it's a great question. I mean, do you have other thoughts about it, Brandon?
Yeah. Many,
Yeah.
but I think what I would look at it is, I think maybe thinking about contemporary problems is an opportunity, where I would flip it in a good way, is an opportunity to take the Dunn paradigm. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read your book, and I'm actually going to kind of now think about how we can think about contemporary problems. So for example, one of the challenges to imagining the city in America is gerrymandering, right? Which de-democratizes the process about how you plan a city. You cannot plan a city for the people if they do not have proper political input on the way that it's run. There's no way you can do that. So what I'm saying is, like, these are like real, we have these contemporary live ecological experiments playing out. Of course, the reason why we all had work off yesterday is because of an individual who helped to conquer this very, very problem in the United States. So my point is, there are these contemporary ecological experiments, right, that we can use as ecological frameworks, even to think about. Thinking about code, for example, you talked about this really nice paper you published in Royal Society Open Science about the ideal temperature. It's well known that housing projects are cold in the winter and actually very, very hot in the summer. So even the way that cities have been crafted have shaped the physiological experience of individuals in a city. You talked about COVID transmission. We now know that individuals who live in housing projects have higher numbers of contacts on average. That frames the evolutionary context through which pathogens evolve. So what I'm saying is, I think these are contemporary examples that are applications of some of the ideas that you articulated. And really, and this is a little plug, shameless plug, for the special issue that we have in evolutionary medicine, public health, which is kind of seeks to address some of these issues. So I have a lot more. Really, thank you for offering that really, really exciting work, and good luck with the book and project.
Thanks, Brandon. I'm delighted to follow up this conversation and keep it going. I appreciate your comments.
Great, thanks so much. So we'll go next to a comment from in the chat from Cynthia Bell. Cynthia says that comparing life in other cultures and climates would be fascinating, trying to understand what's unique and what's shared. I guess adding on to that comment, what do we know so far about that? How much work has been done in comparing life in other cultures and climates?
Yeah, so that's Cynthia, is it, who asked that? Sorry, I'm not seeing that.
Yeah, Cynthia Bell.
It's a great question. So we know it. We don't have a holistic picture. For looking at all of life indoors, it's really a smattering of views of a few places. Where we have a better view is if we focus in on individual lineages that we know more about. And so if we think about fermented food associated microbes, we do see that those are wildly different in different cultural contexts. They have different evolutionary scenarios, different ecological interactions, and they reflect both contemporary aspects of culture and particular histories. And so, for example, it looks like Saccharomyces bread and beer yeast, the canonical yeast, was probably not in the Americas pre-colonially. And so pre-colonially, just from the perspective of fermentation, you had very different microbes involved in this daily household act of ecology. And so we're starting to see those narrow stories, but what the big picture looks like is still pretty unclear. That's a great question.
Great, thank you. Another question in the chat from Raven Luo. This one is a bit more straightforward. Why do toilet seats and pillowcases have the same types of microbes? And then there was some speculation that it's skin contact, but I guess I'm wondering whether it's more than just skin microbes that we're sharing between those surfaces.
Yeah, it's mostly any place that you sit, especially if you don't have clothes on. The same sort of skin and bodily things are winding up in those places. And so in that regard, toilets and pillowcases are picking up some of the same stuff. There's a fair, I mean, it's lunchtime, so I won't go too much there, but there are a fair amount of other bodily microbes on your pillow, on some pillowcases that make them look more like toilet seats too. And I mean, this is one of the dominant household things. It's just where we are, we're constantly falling apart. And so our bodily microbes are just pile up in those places.
Great, thank you. So lots of questions popping up in the chat. Do feel free to raise your hand if you'd like to ask verbally, but I'll keep reading from the chat for now. We have a question from Alan Kugel who asks, given that we have limited ability to control the outcomes, but some actions have long-term effects, how do we decide what the best actions are?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, so I think for me, we need to understand, we need to make sure we're paying attention to the rules of life we already know about and relying on the knowledge we have, but then we have to make decisions. And so, thinking about our everyday biology, we make decisions all the time in which we don't think about their outcomes. And so, for example, antiperspirant use is probably one of the most common everyday ecosystem level alterations of the bodily ecosystem. And we now know that it disfavors a whole set of skin associated microbes that are super ancient associates of human and favors relatively weird new kinds of microbes. And so we make all these decisions already and without paying attention to the consequences. And so I think we need to make these decisions with the consequences in mind. What might the change do? And in some cases, we know a lot. And so we're getting a lot smarter about managing antimicrobial resistance and thinking about how do we use evolutionary insights to manage resistance better. We're getting a lot better at using evolutionary insights to manage cancers. And so we need to make sure that those ideas are mainstream and part of our daily management. But we always know less than we would like to know. But we should at the very least take these broad ideas about which there's a fair amount of consensus in mind.
Great, thank you. So another question in the chat from Terry Taylor. Terrence asks, in imagining future cities, generally it would be an evolutionary process from what has been built in the past, even for so-called new cities, in particular capitals such as Brasilia, Canberra, Washington, DC, etc., and even on smaller scales of garden cities in the UK. Are there particular lessons to be learned from such examples that merit a focused study? So essentially, how we've already evolved our cities and how we might do better at evolving them?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a little bit beyond my wheelhouse, the broad version of that question. Let me think if I have a simple answer to that. No, I just think it's a good question to be thinking about, and also to be comparing not just what cities are like, but what are their trajectories and how do those influence life. I think our data on that question are pretty modest. Yeah, it's a good question. I'll stew on it some. Who was that? I come back to you.
That was Terrence Taylor.
Come back to you.
So something that I'm curious about is specifically thinking about the microbe example. We know that we're dependent on a diverse community of these good microbes, but we're of course seeing right now a lot more pressure to get rid of microbes, especially with SARS-CoV-2 and the COVID-19 pandemic. And even me, like I appreciate and understand we depend on our microbes, but I'm sanitizing things. I'm using hand sanitizer all the time because we have to right now. And we know that we're going to be encountering more of these kind of epidemics and pandemics with climate change and with land use change. And how do we start to think about the tension between needing to keep ourselves safe from these bad microbes while preserving the good microbes, and how best to approach that moving forward?
I think where we can, we need to figure out, what are the actual measures that best help to control each of these new things. And with COVID, we've gotten better at that. We know airborne transmission, very important. We know transmission on your food, less likely to be a problem. And so as we gain that knowledge, the more targeted our interventions can be, the less likely they are to affect all these other things we depend on. And in some cases, it'll be easier. In some cases, that'll be harder. But I think the era of killing everything and hoping we get the current problem is hopefully one we can push behind us.
Great, thank you. So we have time for a few more questions. Feel free to raise your hand at any point. We'll go to another question from the chat for now. Marie Sen had asked, I'm thinking about matter and antimatter, and how the internet and wireless affects humans, the earth, and the universe. Do you have any thoughts on that?
This is like one of the last things my granddad said is he was at the very end, and he asked me to explain antimatter, and I couldn't do it. And it was like the year before he died, and he said, I guess I'm not ever going to understand everything. And so I feel like I'm going to fail on this question again. I'm not sure how to link this up to matter and antimatter. Maybe one step beyond. But if the question asker has ideas, please put them in the chat.
Marie, anything you'd like to contribute about matter and antimatter? I must admit, I don't really know what antimatter is either. So that would be helpful. All right, well, other questions from the audience? I think we've gone through all the questions in the chat. So feel free to raise your hand if you have other thoughts you'd like to share about how we can better engineer our futures. Charlie, did you have a comment or question?
Yeah, sure. First of all, I'm sorry to be late, Rob. I had a scheduling conflict. I didn't navigate very well, and apologies for that. But just thinking about the future of urban areas, one of the things that I was thinking of is just that most of the urban growth that's projected in the future is actually going to be in low and middle income countries. If you look at the forecasts. And I just wonder if you have any thoughts about the specific problems that they face, and any insights in accommodating all of this growth, and have anything to share about that from your perspective.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the first thing I would say is that those same countries are the places we know the least about the living world in those cities. That if you think about tropical cities, our understanding of tropical urban ecology is extraordinarily slim. And so if we focus on the tropics for a second, what the ideal tropical future city looks like with regard to paying attention to life has got to be really different. You have very different disease problems. You have different kinds of spillover problems. The probability that mammals in tropical cities are associated with new potential diseases in those disturbed environments is much higher. And so the thinking is going to have to be different. And we've really not done that work yet. I mean, you've worked a lot in the context of some of those, the edges of some of those cities. Do you have thoughts, Charlie?
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying. I mean, there's a lot of agriculture, for example, and I work in Madagascar, and in the capital there, it's amazing to me how much agriculture there is with cattle, within the city limits, and chickens, of course, a lot of chickens, and a lot of rats, and opportunities for disease transmission. Yeah, but just thinking about how they develop, I mean, it's done. Typically pretty organically, without a lot of planning. And I just wonder if you have any thoughts about how to, or I'm sure people are thinking about this, and I'm just not as familiar with it. How you do that in a more planned way.
So people are thinking about it in different fields. The extent to which there's a holistic endeavor to think both about urban planning, keeping novel pathogens in mind, figuring out urban agriculture, thinking about urban forests. That holistic perspective is very rare, in part because to think about a city, you're at the edge of 10, 15 different disciplines. And there's bears on this, there's a little micro history of urban ecology that I'll have to send around later because I'm going to forget the right citation. But one of the conclusions of this history about early urban ecology is that ecologists intentionally ignored the city because they didn't want ecology to be muddied down by having to interact with other fields. And they were really consciously worried about the need for interdisciplinarity. And so they wanted to define the field of ecology outside of cities with the idea that maybe one day it would be brought back into cities. And so I think we're feeling that absence of ecology's early years from some of these conversations. Yeah, but it's an interesting question. Okay,
well, we're almost at the top of the hour, so I think it's a good point to close down. Rob, I'll have to watch the video because I missed most of your presentation. I'm really sorry, but I love your book, and it is being reviewed for EMPH, so we're happy about that as well. Let me just quickly show you the upcoming talks, if I can figure out how to do that. Okay, I think I'm sharing the right screen now. We heard this great talk today by Rob Dunn. And I also wanted to say thanks to all of you from TriSem for showing up today. I noticed a lot of folks from TriSem, from the local Triangle community attending today. It was great to see so many of you on the talk today. Anyhow, great talk, Rob. Thank you. Next, we have Matt Keller, who's going to be talking about the genetic underpinnings of psychiatric disorders. That'll be February 10th. And then we have another talk in February, later in the month, with William Parker, John Lamont, and others, talking about the hygiene hypothesis and how that relates in particular to the coronavirus pandemic. And so I think people are going to find that one pretty interesting as well. And of course, we go out from there with talks on a variety of different topics, including cancer, evolution of cancer and evolution, other talks on antibiotic resistance, and then a couple on disease ecology. So please stay tuned. Great to see so many people here today, and hope to see you at our next talk in February. Thanks very much.